I remember it like it was yesterday, November 2024, and I was 75 years old, sitting behind the wheel of my beloved 1968 Volkswagen Beetle in the driveway of the home I'd lived in for 40 years. The engine's familiar rumble vibrated through my arthritic hands, and the crisp autumn air stung my cheeks as I took a deep breath. My silver hair caught the last glow of daylight through the windshield, and for a moment, I felt the weight of all those years lift off my shoulders. Then I saw my daughter Lisa, she was 45 now, burst through the front door, standing beside her husband Mark, who looked to be about 48. Her face was flushed with anger, and I could hear her voice wavering as she yelled, "Give us back the car, Hazel. We need the money." For a heartbeat, I simply stared at her, my knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Memories of Robert, my late husband, flooded back. The weekends we spent restoring this Beetle together, the way he used to laugh as we polished its baby blue hood until it gleamed. Without a single word, I pressed the gear to drive and slowly pulled away, leaving Lisa's screams echoing behind me. As I turned onto the street, I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw Mark racing toward me, phone in hand, and even a uniformed officer stepping into the road to block my path. My heart pounded, but in that moment I knew protecting this car, Robert's gift, and our shared history was more important than obeying my daughter's demands. I was born in 1949 in a tiny farming community in rural Pennsylvania. My earliest memories are of dawn's soft glow filtering through the kitchen window as I helped my parents milk the cows before school. When I was 8, both my mother and father succumbed to an unexpected illness within months of each other. I don't recall much of the grief, only the heavy hush that fell over the farmhouse and the way our neighbors rallied around us. My older brother Jacob shouldered the burden of running the dairy operation, and I worked alongside him from that day forward. From dawn until dusk, I learned to haul pails of milk, repair fence posts, and bake bread for the weekly market. Losing my parents so young instilled in me a work ethic and independence I would carry throughout my entire life. In the summer of 1969, when I was 20, a traveling mechanic set up shop in our nearest town. Robert Montgomery was 22, tall and broad-shouldered, with grease-smudged hands and a gentle smile that made my heart flutter. He'd come from a nearby county to help repair farm equipment, and I first saw him in the barnyard, covered in oil but laughing as he coaxed an old tractor back to life. After his workday, he'd join me by the creek, where we'd talk for hours about everything from our favorite folk songs to his dream of opening a small garage. Within weeks, he asked for my hand in marriage, and I agreed without hesitation. When we wed in 1970, Robert promised me a life full of partnership and laughter. In 1975, we moved to suburban Ohio. He wanted to be closer to his aging parents, and I was eager for a change of pace from the farm. That same year, Robert surprised me with a baby blue 1968 Volkswagen Beetle. He'd found it in pieces at a junkyard and spent countless evenings wrenching in our makeshift garage to restore it to its former glory. The Beetle became our pride and joy. Weekends were spent sanding and polishing its chrome, and evenings driving through the countryside with the windows down. I took a job as a nurse's aide at the local hospital while Robert rented a modest bay in a garage and slowly built his reputation as a skilled mechanic. In 1979, 10 years after we first met, our daughter Lisa was born. I still remember the way Robert's eyes shone that day as he held her tiny hand. Raising Lisa required juggling night shifts at the hospital with Saturday morning car shows, but we made it work. The Beetle served as our family cruiser. Lisa's first car seat was fastened into its back seat, and her giggles echoed under its rounded roof. Robert and I took her on weekend road trips, pointing out fall foliage and stopping at roadside diners for pie. Those years were the happiest of my life. Robert's steady presence and kind-hearted nature made every challenge feel surmountable. In February 2005, when I was 55, everything changed. Robert collapsed in the garage one cold morning, clutching his chest. I rushed him to the emergency room, but the doctor said it was a massive heart attack. I held his hand until he drew his last breath. The world felt silent and cold without him. We had scraped together enough savings to cover funeral expenses, but I soon realized that keeping our home and the garage would require selling off investments. I refused to let go of Robert's Beetle, even though it meant parting with half our life savings. In the months that followed, I pored over Robert's old mechanic manuals and took on small repair jobs to generate extra income. I learned to change oil, replace brake pads, and tune carburetors, skills Robert had always taken for granted. Some days, exhaustion and grief threatened to overwhelm me, but I clung to the routine, waking early, tucking Lisa into school, and heading to the garage. My neighbors knew Mrs. Montgomery as the woman who refused to give up. By the time Lisa graduated high school, I had built a modest clientele who trusted me to care for their cars. The Beetle, once a weekend project, now sat quietly under a car cover, waiting for the rare Sunday when I'd crank it up for a drive. Though I missed Robert every day, I found resilience in each wrench I turned and each engine I coaxed back to life. That stubborn determination carried me through long nights of worry. I was both mother and father to Lisa, and the Beetle remained the last tangible reminder of the love Robert and I shared. Late October 2024 came with an uneasy tension in our home. I could feel it rising each evening as Mark's limp grew more pronounced and Lisa's eyes darkened with worry. The bills had begun to pour in weeks ago, hospital invoices, stained with red past due stamps, pharmacy statements for Mark's medications, and notices from specialists whose fees seemed to climb by the day. One night, after a sleepless vigil beside Mark's bed, Lisa sat me down at the kitchen table, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "Mom, we're nearly out of options," she whispered, clutching my hand. Mark's surgery cost more than we anticipated, and every dollar we saved is gone. We can't keep covering these expenses. I watched her as she forced a tearful smile, hoping I'd say something comforting, but her eyes darted toward the covered Beetle parked just beyond the kitchen window. I knew even before she said it what she was about to ask. That evening, after dinner, I found myself cornered in the very kitchen where Robert had once taught me to make gravy from scratch. Lisa stood beside Mark, his face drained of color, yet his gaze held a desperate resolve. The overhead light cast harsh shadows, and I felt as though the walls were closing in on me. Lisa's voice wavered as she let out the demand, "Mom, we're out of options. We need you to give us the Beetle to sell." My heart seized at the words. The Beetle was not simply an old car, it was Robert's gift to me, the culmination of quieter weekends spent tinkering in the garage together. It was every laugh we had shared, every reassurance he had offered when life felt too heavy. Listening to Lisa's plea felt like a blow to my very soul. I pressed both hands against the edge of the sink, my knuckles whitening. My throat felt raw as I managed to whisper, "That Beetle belonged to Robert and me. He restored it for our wedding. It's my last memory of him." I watched Lisa's face go rigid. Her eyes flashed with frustration, then something colder. "Your memories won't pay his hospital bills," she shot back. My breath caught in my chest as if someone had taken hold of it and refused to let go. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. The kitchen grew unbearably quiet, everything hanging on Lisa's next words. Mark's jaw clenched beside her. I could see the shame in his expression, but also the raw fear of what their finances might mean if I refused. Shaking, I backed away and ascended the narrow staircase, each creak of the steps echoing like a faint reminder of Robert's absence. In the sanctuary of our bedroom, I fumbled through drawers until I found a small duffel bag. My hands trembled as I placed inside a well-worn winter coat, a few changes of clothes, and the gray mechanic's rag Robert used until his last day. I slipped my journal, its pages filled with memories and reflections, carefully between the garments, knowing that it was my only confidant now. I paused, staring at the faded photograph taped to my nightstand, Robert smiling, his hand resting on the Beetle's hood. My fingers brushed over his face in the image, and I whispered, "I can't lose the only piece of him I have left," before scribbling those exact words on a small note. I left it on my pillow, the scent of Chanel No. 5 lingering faintly beside it. By the time dawn broke, I was already slipping out the side door in my robe, the Beetle's engine purring to life under me as though it understood the gravity of my flight. The air was crisp, each inhale biting my lungs with cold determination. As I turned onto the street, I glanced back to see Lisa peering through the living room window. Tears glistened on her cheeks, but her posture remained rigid. Equal parts sorrow and frustration, Mark stood behind her, arms folded, his face conveying guilt and desperation. I could tell he worried about my health more than anything. I was 75 after all, and the autumn chill did nothing to ease his fears. But they could not have known how tightly I clung to the Beetle as I drove away, its tires whispering over fallen leaves as though it was the thread keeping me tethered to Robert's memory. In that fragile morning light, I understood that the chasm between us had widened into something almost unbridgeable. They saw only dollar signs in the Beetle's chrome, but I saw 50 years of love, sweat, and hope behind its windshield. As my silhouette faded around the corner, I felt both a sorrowful longing for the home I was leaving and a fierce resolve to protect the legacy Robert and I had built together. I woke before dawn and slipped into the Beetle, my fingers trembling as I turned the key. The engine's familiar rumble felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that for now I still had control. The road out of the neighborhood was quiet. Fallen leaves crunched beneath the tires, and my breath formed tiny clouds in the cold November air. I knew exactly where I was headed: Millie's cabin, the one my childhood friend had inherited on the edge of Bald Pine Woods. It was only 20 miles away, but to me, it felt like an escape into another world. When I finally pulled onto the gravel driveway, the Beetle's headlights cast long shadows among the tall pines. The cabin looked just as it had when I was a girl: rough-hewn logs, a sagging porch, and smoke curling from the chimney. Millie was waiting on the porch, bundled in a faded flannel shirt and a patched cardigan. Her eyes, though wearied by time, still sparkled with concern. Before I could speak, she wrapped me in a wool quilt so heavy I barely felt the chill on my bones. I accepted her bowl of vegetable stew, the savory aroma reminding me of Robert's cooking, and sat before the small mirror perched on a rickety dresser. I barely recognized the reflection staring back: pale cheeks, dark circles under my eyes, and grief etched into every line of my face. And yet, behind that exhaustion, I saw resolve burning in my eyes. I would not let go of the Beetle, even if it meant losing everything I once called home. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I retrieved a worn envelope from the lining of my coat. Robert's handwriting on the outside labeled it for Hazel, emergencies only. Inside was a modest sum, enough to cover rent and basic living expenses for a few months if I stretched it. I forced myself to use a false name, Margaret Reed, when I rented a tiny efficiency apartment in Carlton, a neighboring town. The place was cramped, a single room with a kitchenette and a shared bathroom down the hall. As I signed the lease, I felt a pang of disorientation. For the first time since my parents died, I had nowhere I truly belonged. I forced a small smile at the landlord, who barely glanced at me and walked away feeling the weight of my new anonymity. That first night alone in Carlton, the apartment felt impossibly silent. I drew the curtains against the streetlights, but the quiet still seeped into my bones. I lay on the thin mattress, pressing a hand to my chest as memories flooded in: Robert's deep laugh echoing through the garage, Lisa's wobbly first steps in the kitchen, and the Beetle windscreen reflecting autumn sunshine on our Sunday drives. I whispered into the darkness, "Robert, guide me," but received only the hollow rustle of the curtains in reply. Tears blurred my vision, dripping onto the pillow as the moonlight cast a pale glow across the room. I turned away, clutching my journal like a lifeline, and wrote until my hand cramped, pages filled with memories and prayers, each one steadier than the last. Over the next few days, Millie became my lifeline. She sneaked stew and fresh bread to my apartment, her mending in the form of a sturdy pot pie or a loaf of rye. When I admitted my reading glasses had somehow disappeared amid the chaos, she arrived with a new pair, cat-eye frames tinted a soft rose, making me feel oddly youthful. She also brought along a battered transistor radio she'd found at a yard sale. "It'll keep you company," she said, setting it on my rickety kitchen counter. At night, the gentle crackle of AM stations carried me through long hours, and I found myself humming along to old country tunes, even when the lyrics made my heart ache. Back in the neighborhood, rumors began to swirl. A cousin of Lisa's texted her, "Your mom's lost it, living in a dump." Soon enough, every neighbor seemed to have an opinion on my departure. Lisa's guilt warred with defensiveness each time a new whisper reached her ears. One afternoon, she called, her voice tight, "Mom, are you okay? You have to come home." I forced a calm tone, replying, "Lisa, I'm just taking some time to think." But I sensed her frustration and Mark's impatience through the phone. He would later tell her to focus on their own debts rather than gossip, but by then, whispers of my abandonment had taken root. I knew those whispers would ratchet up pressure to return. But something within me had shifted. The solitude and the hardships of those first days, sleeping in a too-cold apartment, paying bills under a false name, replaying memories until they felt like fresh wounds, revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. That evening, nestled under the quilt Millie had sent, I felt the first flicker of quiet confidence. I might be alone and anxious, struggling to find my bearings, but I was also free to plan my next steps. Robert's emergency fund would only last so long, and I needed to stretch every penny, rationing stew, selling knit scarves to the thrift store, and relying on Millie's visits as lifelines. Yet beneath the loneliness and persistent ache, I recognized a fierce determination rising within me. The Beatles' engine revving in my memory, the soft scrape of tools on metal, those sounds reminded me who I was. I was Hazel Montgomery, daughter, wife, mother, and now an unwavering guardian of my husband's legacy. And I would not let anyone steal that from me. Over a weak cup of instant coffee one chilly morning, Millie placed her hand on mine and said gently, "Hazel, remember what Robert always said, never let anyone mess with the title to your Beatle." I blinked, the steam from the coffee swirling between us like wisps of memory. Of course, I had seen Robert's service contract and title tucked away in our old safe, but grief had turned my mind into a fog. Now that small phrase Millie reminded me of felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm. I had to find that title before anyone else did. That afternoon, my heart thudded in my chest as I climbed into the Beetle, its engine sputtering awake like an old friend stirring from slumber. I drove to the county motor vehicle office in Carlton, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The building looked nondescript from the outside, faded brick walls and a cracked sidewalk. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered above rows of folding chairs. I handed the clerk my driver's license and explained as calmly as I could that I needed to request the original title record for a 1968 Volkswagen Beetle registered to Robert and Hazel Montgomery. The clerk's pen scratched across the paper, and he told me to wait in a small back office until the records clerk called my name. Minutes felt like hours as I sat on that plastic chair. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I closed my eyes, picturing Robert's face, his easy grin as he tightened a bolt, the way he'd chuckle when I teased him about oil-slicked hands. Finally, a gray-haired woman called my name. I followed her past rows of filing cabinets into a windowless room filled with shelves of paper records. Her expression softened when I told her my situation. "Your husband's name and yours are both on this title, Ms. Montgomery," she said, sliding a yellowed folder across the desk. My fingers trembled as I opened it and saw the typed words "survivorship clause" stamped near the top. Upon the death of the first-named owner, title shall vest in surviving owner. There it was in black and white. If Robert died first, I alone held legal ownership of the Beetle. I felt my breath catch, tears pooling in my eyes. In that moment, fear and relief collided. My daughter and son-in-law could never force me to sell what legally belonged only to me. I clutched the folder to my chest and whispered, "Thank you, Robert." Escorted out of the office with the official photocopy of the title record, I drove home with a newfound sense of purpose. I moved back to my apartment in a day. That evening, Millie arranged for me to meet Marta Chu, a retired paralegal she'd known from their church potlucks. Marta was waiting at a small cafe table, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and a stack of legal pads before her. As I slid into the seat opposite her, Marta offered me a gentle smile and said, "Let's review what this clause means." She pointed to the photocopy and explained in simple terms that no court could compel me to sell the beetle. The survivorship clause was ironclad. I felt a rush of emotions, relief that the legal ground had shifted in my favor, disbelief that my family had not realized this meant to protect me, and a spark of newfound strength. Tears blurred my vision as Marta laid out the paperwork I'd need should Lisa or Mark challenge me in court: an affidavit of my sole ownership, notarized copies of the title, and witness statements. My hands shook as I wrote it all down, absorbing every detail. That night, I lay awake on the lumpy mattress of my efficiency apartment, the ceiling fan humming overhead. My gaze drifted to the small mirror perched on the dresser. My cheeks were stained from the day's tears, and the lines around my eyes had deepened, but my chin was lifted. There was fire in my gaze that hadn't been there a week ago. I pressed a hand to my heart and whispered, "I won't let them steal him from me." Somewhere in Carlton, Lisa and Mark likely believed I was broken, vulnerable, and alone. They did not know how fiercely I'd come alive the moment I knew I held the legal key to my future. The following morning, I sat at the kitchen table of my apartment and composed a text to Lisa. "I'm overwhelmed and need counseling before discussing anything further. I'll be in touch." I hit send and drew in a shaky breath, knowing full well they would not suspect that I was anything but uncertain. In truth, I was already planning my next move, gathering documents, lining up potential witnesses, and preparing myself mentally for the confrontation ahead. But for now, that text would buy me the time I needed. Later, I headed to a small shop downtown and purchased a mailer box, some packing tape, and a stack of plain envelopes. I folded these documents carefully: copies of the title, the witness affidavit from Millie and Marta, and a typed notice outlining my sole ownership, and sealed them. If the time came, I would have everything in order to file for a declaratory judgment. But more importantly, I felt something else stirring, a sense of reclaiming my own agency. For months, grief and fear had held me silent. Now, I felt the first stirrings of purpose. That evening, I stood before my mirror once more. I smoothed my gray hair back from my face and studied the woman in reflection. Her eyes carried both sorrow and fierce determination. She was no longer simply a widow fleeing conflict. She was a defender of her own history, ready to stand up for the life Robert and I had built together. As I whispered my vow again, "I won't let them steal him from me," I felt the words settle into my very bones. In that moment, I knew I had discovered a hidden strength: the courage to fight, the clarity of purpose, and the unexpected ally in the form of a legal clause etched on paper years ago by the man I loved. And with that knowledge, I resolved to return, dignity intact, and face whatever came next. That afternoon, I decided it was time to reconnect with some of the people Robert and I had helped over the years. First on my list was Jack Turner, a grizzled farmer in his 60s who'd once financed an engine rebuilt on credit when his old pickup broke down mid-harvest. I found him in his barn, elbow deep in a tractor's transmission. When he looked up and saw the beetle pull off its cover, his eyes widened. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Montgomery," he said, wiping grease from his hands. I explained my situation, how Lisa and Mark had demanded the car, how I'd fled and discovered the survivorship clause. Jack's face hardened, and he placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Nobody's going to take that car from you, Hazel," he said. I'll come to court and swear on a stack of Bibles that I've known you and Robert for decades. You did right by every engine and every neighbor." His voice was gravelly but unwavering. As I climbed back into the Beetle, I felt a swell of gratitude and the first flicker of relief in knowing I wasn't alone. Encouraged, I next visited the little Methodist church where I'd taken Lisa as a child. Pastor Nina Morales greeted me warmly at the door. Her soft brown eyes reflected genuine concern. We sat in her small office, the walls lined with encouragement posters and photos of church picnics. "Hazel, dear, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. I laid out the timeline, the demands for the Beetle, my flight to Carlton, and the legal discovery at the county clerk's office. When I mentioned the survivorship clause, Na's expression shifted to determination. "We need to rally the congregation," she said. Within days, she arranged for me to speak at a midweek gathering. In the church hall, a dozen or so members, women who'd baked pies for funerals Robert and I hosted, men who'd traded tools in our garage, gathered around the long, folding tables. Each held a pen and a prepared affidavit. They wrote compassionate statements detailing Robert's integrity, my dedication to the community, and the importance of honoring a widow's rightful ownership. When they were done, Na folded each affidavit into a manila envelope and sealed them with pink ribbons. "If you need these in court, we'll testify," she said, her quiet confidence bolstering my own. As I left the church clutching those affidavits, I felt my resolve harden like steel. That same week, word of my disappearance and the Beetle dispute reached local blogger Jordan Kim, a 30-year-old with a flair for fair reporting. Late one evening, I sat on the edge of my bed listening to the crackle of my transistor radio when I heard a notification ping on my phone. Dow vanishes over family dispute. Who really owns the Beetle? The article bore Jordan's byline, accompanied by a photo of my covered Beetle. He'd cataloged the timeline, rumors about my abandonment, the family feud, and the possible legal battle. Jordan's tone was measured. He interviewed neighbors who spoke in my favor and, even more significantly, praised Robert's generosity. He quoted former clients like Jack Turner, and he mentioned the church's affidavit. Within hours, the S-Post carried over 1,000 comments, many condemning Lisa and Mark's behavior, calling it heartless to demand a cherished heirloom from a widow. Some offered to help with my bills or volunteer at my garage. I read through the comments late into the night, tears stinging my eyes at the outpouring of support. For the first time since I left home, I felt seen and understood. The next afternoon, Lisa called me at the apartment. I could hear the tension in her voice. "Mom, have you seen that blog post?" she asked, her words clipped. "People are talking. Neighbors are calling me, asking if this is really true." I remained calm, responding, "Yes, I've seen it." Jordan did a fair job. I offered no further comment, knowing she would rush to see me. That evening, just as dusk settled, I heard a knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, Lisa stood there, her face pale and her eyes glistening. Under the dim hallway light, I saw guilt etched into every line of her face. She pressed a copy of Jordan's article into my hand and said, her voice trembling, "I didn't realize." "Mom, I'm so sorry." She sank onto the kitchen stool, and for a moment, I let her sit in silence. Then I nodded toward the stack of affidavits on my small table and said gently, "The title clause means I legally own the Beetle. I won't sell." Lisa's face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She whispered, "I never meant for it to become like this." I reached out to touch her hand, and for a moment, we sat together in the quiet, mother and daughter desperately trying to bridge the chasm between us. Meanwhile, Mark's reaction back in our old neighborhood was one of fury and desperation. That same evening, I imagined him in their kitchen, fist slamming onto the countertop so hard it rattled family photos. A family friend who was a real estate broker arrived at his doorstep after Mark called, frantic for advice. When the friend explained the survivorship clause, that no court could force Hazel Montgomery to sell without her consent, Mark's face turned ashen. He began to pace the kitchen floor, muttering about medical bills and wondering how he and Lisa could ever recover from this public shaming. The neighborhood gossipers already whispered about how the poor daughter had to beg her mother, unaware that the only poor person was the one in need of empathy. Mark's hand hovered over the phone as if he considered calling me to beg for compromise. But he knew I wouldn't budge. As I pictured him kneeling on that linoleum floor, torn between guilt for hurting me and fear of losing everything, I felt a mix of pity and resolute strength. The allies I'd gathered, clients like Jack, church members led by Pastor Nina, and supporters from Jordan's blog, had given me a shield. I was no longer the widow hiding in Carlton. I was a woman backed by her community, determined to stand firm. That night, as I lay in my small bed, I realized that the web of support around me was more powerful than any demands Lisa or Mark could make. I folded the church affidavit neatly and slid it into my journal. Tomorrow, I would start preparing to return, not as a frightened old woman, but as someone with allies at her back and the law firmly on her side. That afternoon, Hazel parked the Beetle a few houses down from Lisa and Mark's home. She'd wrapped a faded volunteer community cleanup badge in plastic and pinned it to her cardigan. Her heart pounded as she stepped onto the front porch of the house she had once shared with Robert and later with her daughter's family. The facade looked much as it had in happier years, white siding with green shutters, a flower bed of purple pansies flanking the walkway. But the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though Lisa's anger and Mark's desperation had seeped into the very walls. Lisa opened the door before Hazel could ring the bell, offering a stiff smile. "Thanks for coming," she said, handing Hazel a broom and dustpan. Hazel's jaw tightened. She followed Lisa around the corner into the two-car garage, where Mark stood waiting with boxes of old auto parts stacked against the back wall. He handed Hazel a cardboard box full of rusty wrenches and spark plugs without returning her gaze. Both daughter and son-in-law spoke to her in clipped tones, courtesy wrapped in tension. Hazel nodded politely as Lisa ushered her along the concrete floor, pointing out oil-stained rags and broken toolboxes that needed to be sorted. She swept the floor in neat, methodical strokes, trying to steady her breathing. Each clink of metal and echo of her broom against the cement reminded her how far the relationship had fallen. In the past, she and Lisa would have laughed as they stacked those very tools, joking about how Robert would have labeled every wrench by size and year. Now silence reigned. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the garage windows, Hazel gathered her courage and closed the garage door behind her. She walked into the living room, where framed family photos lined the mantel, Robert and Hazel on their wedding day, a smiling Lisa graduating high school, and one of Lisa cradling her newborn firstborn. She laid the Beatles' original title on the coffee table, its embossed seal catching a slant of light. Lisa and Mark sat on opposing sides of the couch, eyes locked on the document. "This car was Robert's and mine," Hazel began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She pointed to the fine print under her husband's signature. "Upon the death of the first-named owner, title shall vest in surviving owner." Owned it together. Now that he's gone, the car is mine alone. Her gaze met Lisa's. For a moment, Lisa's expression flickered between disbelief and rage. "You're hiding behind a piece of paper because you're too selfish to help us." Lisa's outburst echoed off the living room walls. She stood abruptly, fists clenched, cheeks flushed. "What about Mark's surgery? What about our family?" Hazel's chest tightened at the words. She raised a hand, trying to calm her daughter. "Your surgery was our priority, but I'm not selling my husband's car." Mark's face contorted with anger. He leaned forward as though to snatch the title away. "You've left us with nothing," he snarled. His fingers grazed the edge of the paper as if trying to rip it from her grip. Hazel held her ground, meeting his gaze without flinching. I use the emergency fund Robert set aside for situations like this to help pay for your expenses. I have been more than fair, but this car is the last piece of him I have." Mark slammed his fist on the coffee table, rattling the framed photos. The clatter of glass on wood made Hazel flinch inwardly. "Fine, take it to court," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, as Mark stormed out of the room. She avoided Hazel's eyes and bolted after him. The echo of their footsteps dwindled down the hallway until only the faint click of the front door signaled their departure. Alone in the silence that followed, Hazel sank onto the sofa. She folded her hands in her lap, and her gaze fell on the shiny brass seal at the bottom of the title. With a trembling finger, she traced the edge of her husband's name as if seeking strength from the raised letters. Memories surged unbidden. The last time she saw Robert alive, lying on a makeshift workbench in the garage, the smell of oil and sweat heavy in the air. She heard his whisper echoing in her mind. "Protect the beetle, Hazel." At that moment, the full weight of her journey overtook her. The victories she'd found, legal clarity, community support, felt distant against the raw ache of family rifts. Her vision blurred as tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. She pressed a shaking hand to her chest, her fingertip resting just above her heart where grief and exhaustion settled together. "I'm so tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves judged her need to protect a simple car in the face of her daughter's suffering. Hazel closed her eyes and allowed herself a long, shuddering breath. The echoes of Lisa's anger reverberated in her mind alongside Mark's desperate accusations. Yet within that moment of despair, a faint ember of resolve glowed. She reminded herself of the affidavit waiting at her apartment. Jack Turner had pledged to testify. The church's character statements, Jordan Kim's article preserving her dignity in the public eye, they were not mere papers. They were tangible proof that her stand was just. Still, that proof offered little comfort against the immediate toll, the hollow ache behind her ribs, the sting of betrayal, the palpable absence of the home she once knew. Minutes passed in silence before Hazel rose from the sofa. She gathered the title gently in her hands and placed it back into her purse. Standing in the center of the living room, she took a steadying breath and smoothed the front of her cardigan. She would face what came next. She would endure the sleepless nights, the whispered doubts, and the judging eyes. But first, she allowed herself to acknowledge how deeply she hurt, how deeply she loved both her husband and the family he helped build. And in that painful recognition, she found the seeds of a determination that, even amid exhaustion, refused to be extinguished. I arrived at the courthouse early on a brisk winter morning. The Beetle parked discreetly around the corner. My hands trembled as I clutched the thick envelope Martichu had prepared for me, containing copies of the original title, the affidavit from Jack Turner and other former clients, printed pages of Jordan Kim's blog post, and the notarized witness statements from Pastor Na's congregation. Each document felt like a tangible shield against the injustice Lisa and Mark had tried to force on me. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, I took a seat in the front row. Marta sat at the table beside me, her stoic presence a steady anchor. On the other side of the aisle, Lisa and Mark fidgeted in their chairs, faces turned downward. The gallery behind me was already filling with neighbors, Jack Turner in his work-worn overalls, Pastor Nina clutching her Bible, and several church members in their Sunday best. Jordan Kim hovered near the back, his camera poised for any moment of drama. When Judge Patricia Reynolds entered, her black robe swirling, a hush fell over the room. Marta rose first, presenting the envelope to the court clerk. "Your Honor, I represent Miss Hazel Montgomery in a declaratory judgment action to affirm her sole ownership of a 1968 Volkswagen Beetle," she began, voice calm but firm. The judge nodded and indicated for us to proceed. Marta laid out the evidence methodically. She handed the judge the original title, pointing to the survivorship clause. Upon the death of the first named owner, title shall vest in the surviving owner, she read aloud, her finger tracing the embossed seal. Then she introduced Jack Turner, who stepped forward and took the stand. With a firm voice, Jack recounted how Robert and I had helped him keep his old pickup running back in 2003. Credit extended without question. He looked directly at the judge. Mrs. Montgomery and her late husband were pillars of this community. They treated everyone fairly. I can attest that Hazel has every legal right to keep that car. Next came Pastor Nina, holding her Bible as if it were a shield. Your Honor, she said, voice resonant, I have known Hazel and her family for decades. We in the congregation have witnessed her unwavering integrity. We wrote letters attesting to her character and Robert's. It would be a moral travesty to strip her of what is rightfully hers. The judge nodded, flipping through the stack of affidavits sealed with a pink ribbon. Finally, Marta requested that the court take notice of Jordan Kim's blog post. A printout was handed to the judge, and a hush rippled through the spectators. The article detailed the extent of the community's support for me, quoting neighbors who condemned Lisa and Mark's demands as cruel. Even in that solemn courtroom, I felt a surge of warmth knowing that my story had resonated beyond our family walls. When it was Lisa and Mark's turn, the air shifted. Lisa rose first, her voice quavering as she tried to explain their side. Your Honor, we never intended to treat Mom unfairly, she began, looking at her shoes. We were overwhelmed by medical bills, and we assumed she would understand. Marta's cross-examination was gentle but unyielding. Did you ever inform your mother of your plan before assuming her agreement? Marta asked. Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, No, ma'am. We never told her. We assumed she'd give us the car because she knew our situation. The judge's gaze stayed on Lisa, and I saw her shoulders slump. Mark stood next. His cheeks were flushed, and he avoided eye contact as he admitted under oath, we never showed her the bills until after we decided to sell. We assumed she'd agree to help without question. He glanced at me and guilt flickered in his eyes. Marta asked, Were you aware that the title contained a survivorship clause? Mark hesitated, then shook his head. I wasn't, he said. Lisa found out last week. At that moment, the judge tapped her gavel lightly, as if to punctuate the truth settling over the courtroom. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, steepled her fingers, and addressed us. Having reviewed the original title and all affidavits provided, this court finds that the survivorship clause is legally enforceable. The plaintiff, Ms. Hazel Montgomery, is the sole owner of the 1968 Volkswagen Beetle. Any attempt to sell or transfer said vehicle without her express consent is void. The court sides with Ms. Montgomery. Her words landed like a verdict hammered in stone. A murmur rippled through the gallery. I felt my breath catch as relief flooded every part of me. Jack and Pastor Nina sat straighter, their faces bright with vindication. Lisa and Mark's faces flushed with shame. I met Lisa's gaze, and our eyes locked for a brief moment, hers filled with remorse, mine filled with both sorrow and steel. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Jordan's camera flashed, capturing the stunned looks on Lisa and Mark's faces as they stepped out into the bright midday sun. I heard snippets of their microphones. Widows' rights upheld. Justice for Hazel. Community rallies behind elderly widow against family demands. As I made my way to the press area, Jordan approached with his recorder. Hazel, he said quietly, how does it feel to have the community on your side? I managed a small, grateful smile. I feel blessed, I replied, to have people who understand that some things, like love and memory, aren't meant to be sold. Later, as I walked past neighbors holding handmade signs, respect our elders. Justice for Hazel. I sensed a collective exhale, as though the entire town had been holding its breath for this moment. Lisa and Mark lingered nearby, the weight of public scorn evident in their slumped posture. They avoided eye contact, likely aware that cameras would capture their remorse for everyone to see. That evening, back at my efficiency apartment, exhaustion washed over me. I sank into the threadbare armchair and held the official court order in my hands, tears of relief and sorrow mingling on my cheeks. In the hush, I heard Robert's voice whispering in my mind, "You did it, love." My heart swelled with gratitude for the legal clause that protected me, for Marta's guidance, for every neighbor who signed an affidavit, and for Jordan's fair reporting. I knew the road ahead would still be challenging, particularly in rebuilding the fractured bonds with Lisa and Mark. But in that moment, I allowed myself to savor the victory. I had defended the last tangible piece of my husband's legacy, and I had done so with dignity and the steadfast support of a community that believed in justice. That evening, the renovated garage brimmed with quiet anticipation. What had once been Robert's workspace, benches lined with wrenches and oil-stained rags, had been transformed into a community workshop with shelves holding small crates of parts and a row of folding chairs set near the open garage door. Strings of warm Edison bulbs cast a soft glow across the concrete floor. Pastor Nina Morales stood near the entrance, greeting each person with a gentle nod. Jack Turner, in his dungarees, Marta Chu clutching a binder of legal papers, Jordan Kim with a camera slung over his shoulder, and half a dozen church members clutching candles or toolkits. Each face radiated solidarity rather than sympathy, as though they were there to honor more than just a legal victory. They were there to celebrate the strength of a widow who had refused to be silenced. As dusk settled, the garage door creaked open again, and Lisa and Mark arrived, moving hesitantly toward the center of the space. Lisa's cheeks were flushed from the chilly evening breeze, and Mark's breath billowed in small clouds. They carried an awkward bouquet of lilies, white and slightly drooping. Neither saw the rows of neighbors welling up with expectant eyes. They expected a small private meeting, not a gathering of supporters. As they stepped into the pale light, a hush descended. Every gaze in the room fell upon them, a living testament to Hazel's newfound allies. Lisa's breath caught when she recognized Pastor Nina's serene face. "Mom," she whispered as she approached, voice quivering. Hazel stood at the head of a repurposed workbench, her cardigan buttoned and her posture unyielding. When Lisa came closer, Hazel offered a small, non-judgmental nod and gestured toward a nearby stool. The once empty workshop now felt like hallowed ground filled with people who had pledged themselves to candlelight and hammers in solidarity. At a nod from Hazel, the crowd receded slightly, giving space for the family to speak. Lisa's knees buckled as she sank onto the workbench's edge, her bouquet clattering onto the concrete. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed her palms to her face. Mark lingered a half step behind her, shoulders hunched. Hazel descended from the platform, each step measured until she stood beside her daughter. She wrapped an arm gently around Lisa's shoulders, guiding her to rest her head against Hazel's chest. "I'm so sorry," Lisa's voice cracked through her sobs. "I thought I was protecting us. I never meant to hurt you. I never saw how much the beetle meant to you, how much it was everything from my childhood to your life with Dad." Her words were raw, each tear carving a glisten down her cheek. When she lifted her head, Hazel met her gaze, calm yet resolute. "You never asked if I was okay losing the car, Lisa," Hazel replied softly, her voice steady though her own heart pounded. She gently brushed a lock of hair from Lisa's forehead. "You didn't consider that each mile in that beetle was a memory you shared with me and your father. It wasn't just transportation. It was love made manifest, wheel by wheel." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes focused on the dusty floor before him. Finally, he knelt on one knee, the lily slipping from his grasp and landing at Hazel's feet. He looked up, his eyes glistening with remorse. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, his voice thick, "I just wanted to keep my wife alive. I didn't think my mother-in-law would risk her health for a car." He paused as though weighing each word. "I thought the bills were more important than memories. I was wrong." Hazel's gaze softened at the sight of Mark's contrition. The tension in her shoulders eased, though she still held the dignity of a matriarch wronged. "You have your reasons, Mark," she said quietly. "We all want to protect our loved ones." But the beetle was never just metal and paint. It was the embodiment of a life Robert and I built together. You needed to see it as that. Suddenly, a ripple ran through the gathered crowd. From the shadows beyond the open garage door, neighbors stepped forward, holding lit candles and old tools, hammers, wrenches, and files raised as silent symbols of solidarity. The glow of candlelight mingled with the soft shadows of the workshop's bulbs, illuminating faces etched with respect and empathy. Encouraged by this display, several church members began to hum the opening notes of "Lean on Me," the hymn I once sang at Robert's bedside. The notes were tentative at first, an unsteady murmur, but soon the entire gathering joined in, creating a chorus of compassionate voices resonating off cinder block walls. Lisa lifted her tear-streaked face to watch the neighbors as they sang, flames flickering in their eyes. Jack Turner's gravelly voice rang out, "Lean on me when you're not strong." As the hymn swelled, Mark tightened his grip on Hazel's daughter, standing to join the song with a trembling but heartfelt, "And I'll be your friend." The community's applause followed the final lyric, a warm wave of encouragement washing over the family. In that luminescent moment, Lisa's sobs slowed and finally ceased. She turned to Mark, and they knelt side by side before Hazel, heads bowed. "Mom, we're so sorry," Lisa whispered, her voice muffled. Mark's eyes glistened even brighter as he added, "We understand now. It wasn't just a car. I promise to honor what it represents." Hazel's eyes began to glisten as well, though she blinked back fresh tears of both pain and relief. She knelt before them, placing her hands gently on their bowed heads. "I forgive you," she said, her voice unwavering but tender. She lifted their faces, cradling them in her hands. "But you must remember, my worth isn't in what I own. My worth is in love and memory. Things that no amount of money can replace." As the final embers of candle flame flickered, the workshop felt suffused with a new warmth. Neighbors raised tools in salute, symbolic gestures honoring the resilience and unity that had led to this reconciliation. In that space, under the soft hum of evening light, Hazel felt an emotional reversal wash through her. The wound of betrayal had been staunched by confession, apology, and collective empathy. She held Lisa's hand, then offered Mark a gentle nod. The world outside the garage, the legal battles, the whispered gossip, seemed distant now, eclipsed by the shared vow of family and community to lean on one another. In the quiet that followed, Hazel allowed a small, grateful smile to break across her face. Around her, the workshop transformed from a battleground into a haven where forgiveness had taken root and where the memory of Robert would continue to guide every heartbeat and every mile driven in the beloved Beetle. In the weeks after the courthouse victory, I felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring in my bones. The morning frost still clung to the grass when I decided to transform Robert's old garage into something greater than a mere workspace. I would turn it into a free vintage mechanics club for seniors and teens. Every Saturday afternoon, I unlocked the creaking doors and flipped on the yellow overhead light. The space looked different now. Oil drums had been cleared away, and long wooden workbenches stood neatly aligned. At the far corner, I parked the Beetle on a raised platform, its baby blue paint gleaming under a fresh coat of wax. It sat there as both a teaching model and a symbol of resilience, a reminder that love, memory, and hard work could carry you through the darkest storms. My first students were Ms. Abernathy, an 82-year-old widow who'd never handled a wrench, and Jamal, a 14-year-old who'd been kicked out of an auto shop work-study for lack of focus. As they filed into the garage, I guided them toward foldable stools I'd borrowed from the church. I passed around safety goggles and a set of basic tools, screwdrivers, pliers, and socket wrenches. We started with checking tire pressure on the Beetle's wheels, discussing why even the oldest cars needed proper upkeep. I watched Miss Abernathy's frail hands tighten the lug nuts, her face lighting up with a flush of accomplishment. Jamal, meanwhile, let out a triumphant laugh when he managed to loosen a stubborn lug. In those small moments, the whir of the air compressor and the smell of fresh motor oil, I felt Robert's presence. This was exactly what he would have wanted, connecting generations through the shared language of machinery. Every Saturday, more faces arrived. Mr. Patel, my former neighbor, wanted to learn how to change his sedan's oil. A handful of teenagers whose parents hadn't yet taught them that patience and persistence could save you a fortune in repair bills. I had printed up simple instruction sheets, complete with hand-drawn diagrams, and taped them to the garage walls. We moved on to changing brake drums, swapping air filters, and even tuning carburetors. By midday, the garage hummed with conversation, seniors sharing stories of cars long gone, teens marveling at the Beetle's old-school design. Each time I explained a technique, I felt my own confidence grow. The memory of Robert guiding my hands through engine parts felt as palpable as ever. On Sundays, Lisa began to join me. She arrived each week around 10 o'clock in the morning, hair pulled back, carrying a stack of printed flyers to post at the community center. At first, she hovered at the periphery, offering timid assistance, passing out donuts and coffee, wiping grease from someone's hands with paper towels. Eventually, she began telling her own story, how she'd realized too late the emotional value behind the Beetle. I'd watch as her eyes grew moist when she spoke, not out of shame, but out of sincere regret. "I never want another person to feel as lost as I felt," she told a packed group one afternoon. "That's why I want to help my mom share her knowledge." Her voice quivered, but the audience's warm applause encouraged her further. I felt my weary trust in her begin to thaw as she volunteered to help me catalog donated tools and teach basic engine safety rules. Mark's contributions came in a different form. He spent every Thursday evening hauling tool donations, boxes of wrenches, old jacks, and even a refurbished engine hoist to the garage. He'd arrive breathless, apologizing for tracking oil onto the concrete floor, but he never wavered. Over time, he started offering free car checkups for elderly neighbors, tuning carburetors, tightening belts, and inspecting brake lines. Word spread quickly. Montgomery's place does free tune-ups for seniors. I caught glimpses of him explaining spark plug gaps to a retired school teacher, his posture more relaxed and sincere than I'd ever seen. With each gesture, he showed that he understood the Beetle wasn't a commodity. It was Robert's legacy, and now it was ours to share with the community. As trust slowly rebuilt between us, I felt my heart lighten. One crisp spring morning, I watched Lisa guide a teenager through cleaning the Beetle's carburetor. She chuckled at his wide-eyed wonder as he tilted the metal piece under fluorescent light. Mark stood nearby, offering encouragement as the teen reassembled the parts. I realized then how far we'd come from legal battles and bitter arguments to this scene of shared purpose. It felt as though the garage itself exhaled in relief. The smell of oil and engine grease was replaced, if only for a moment, by the warmth of reconciliation. A year after Robert's death, I hosted our first annual memorial car show outside the garage. Dozens of neighbors arrived, proudly showcasing their restored vintage vehicles, a cherry red '57 Chevy, a cream-colored Ford Model A, and even a pale, yellow Beetle that reminded me of my own. Lisa and Mark co-hosted alongside me, greeting friends and strangers alike. The church choir sang "Lean on Me" by the garage door, and local bakers donated pies and lemonade. When I climbed onto the garage's raised platform to give a short speech, crowds held candles and trays of cookies, the soft glow of dusk settling around us. "Thank you all for being here," I began, my voice shaking only slightly. "This show isn't just about cars. It's about community, memory, and the power of standing together." The Beetle sat off to my right, its headlights reflecting the sun's last rays. Neighbors clapped, and I caught sight of Jack Turner wiping tears from his eyes. Lisa beamed next to me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. Mark stood tall, his eyes meeting mine with pride rather than guilt. Late that night, After the last guest had departed and the candles had burned down, I sat on a metal stool by the now quiet workbench. The garage's open door framed a sky full of stars, and I pulled out my leather-bound journal. My pen moved deliberately as I wrote. I once feared losing my past, but I found my future in helping others. The Beetle was never just a car. It was the engine of my hope and love. I closed the journal, its pages now shimmering with fresh ink. I rose and walked to the corner where the Beetle rested, its headlights dim but still reflecting moonlight off the garage window. In that silver glow, I saw a beacon of continuity, promising that though life had shifted in ways I never anticipated, the spirit of Robert's love and my own resilience would continue to guide me. With a deep breath, I closed the garage door gently, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, I had reclaimed not just a car, but the life Robert and I had built and passed on to a community that would keep it alive for generations to come. I still remember the warmth of that June afternoon in 2025. I stood in my driveway, kneeling beside the Beetle, a soft cloth in hand as I polished its baby blue hood until it gleamed under the midday sun. Through the garage's front window, I could see the bronze plaque I'd hung above the workbench, Montgomery's Community Workshop. Hood, I had placed a single white rose, its petals stark against the pale paint, a reminder of Robert's gentle spirit woven through every pound of metal. A young man, just 18 years old, bounded up beside me. He wrapped me in a quick hug and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to fix my very first car." His gratitude made my chest swell. Nearby, a 16-year-old girl sat on the driveway curb, her nose buried in the beginner's booklet I had written months ago, sketches of wrenches and simple engine diagrams. I watched her flipping pages, her eyes bright with excitement, and I realized that laughter and gratitude still echoed stronger here than any grief ever could. Lisa appeared then, balancing a tray of lemonades. She'd been volunteering every Sunday, a steady presence at my side. She paused to give me a quick smile, her own exhaustion hidden behind newfound determination. Together, we watched as a young adult, formerly shy but now brimming with confidence, stepped up to announce an upcoming auto safety seminar. Mark followed, rolling out a row of neatly organized toolkits for elderly participants waiting in the shade. Neighbors waved to him, appreciative of the free checkups he'd organized. I saw the way he carried himself now, no longer driven by desperation or fear, but by an earnest desire to give back. As dusk began to settle, I wandered toward the front bumper of the Beetle and sat down. Across from me, the purple flower beds I had planted earlier in spring glowed under the fading light, each bloom a symbol of resilience that had taken root in my own life. I gently brushed my fingertips over the Beetle's chrome trim and whispered to the warm evening breeze, "Robert, our love lives on in every life we touch." The air carried that confession into the stillness, and I felt his presence in the rustle of leaves and the soft hum of passing cars. Behind me, the workshop lamps glowed golden, casting long shadows across the driveway. As I leaned back and gazed at my silhouette against that light, I knew that our legacy, built on sweat, love, and unwavering resolve, would continue to shine just like the Beetle itself. Have you ever stood up for what mattered most? Share your story in the comments. Your voice inspires others. If Hazel's journey moved you, give this video a like. Subscribe to Love Spoken Here and hit the bell to hear more true life stories of resilience every day. Share this with someone who needs a reminder. It's never too late to claim your own legacy.